Pete Yost here. Jake and Steve and I just want to thank Huber Engineered Woods for their sponsorship of our UnBuild It podcast. It's easy to speak well of a company when they use building science and systems thinking to develop working systems for high-performance buildings. That certainly goes for the ZIP system. The ZIP system integrates all four control layers: water, air, vapor, and thermal. Its components, polymer bonded coating on OSB, acrylic PSA tape, stretched sill pan flashing, and liquid flash sealant are all top-of-the-line building products, compatible and designed for durability. Throw in the ZIP R panels for continuous exterior insulation, and that's all four control layers. Seem a bit too good to be true? Then consider their system 30-year warranty, their complete online set of info resources, and their top-notch tech hotline. Be the best with the best.
Welcome to the UnBuild It Podcast. I'm Jake Bruton, and today I'm joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Peter Yost and Steve Baczek.
Hey, Jake.
Good day to all. I want to thank you for tuning in and listening to the UnBuild It Podcast. We know there's plenty of content on the internet, and there's plenty of other places you could be, so we're very thankful that you're here. We thought in this, the UnBuild It Podcast, Episode 1, we would cover two basic topics. Number one, who are we? And number two, why are we here? So let's start. I'm going to throw it to Peter Yost, and Peter is going to tell us who he is, what his industry experience is, and then we'll see if we need to challenge Peter on any of his own bio stuff. So, Peter Yost, welcome, buddy.
Thanks, Jake. Great to be here. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Pete.
So it's Pete Yost. I was a builder remodeler for many years after teaching high school for 4 years. Used to work summers with my brothers and then had more fun on the job site than I did in the classroom. We did remodeling some new homes, and the joke on the job site was, whenever we couldn't figure out a flashing detail, we would say, oh yeah, that's about 20 years of higher education down the drain. We did things pretty much the way Joe Prue taught us. Joe Prue is my oldest brother's father-in-law. He was a seventh-generation French-Canadian builder, carpenter, weighed about 125 pounds with his belt on. And you did things Joe's way or the highway. And so I didn't turn my brain on much when I was on the job site. I was just too busy trying to keep up with the technical side of building. And it really wasn't until I got to the NAHB Research Center in 1993 and somebody paid me to learn more about building. That was about 7 or 8 years. Went from there to building.
Pete, how did you wind up at the NAHB Training Center?
Yeah. So when I was doing my graduate work in resource economics at the University of New Hampshire, I was doing it on construction waste, how to minimize it, how to recycle. I helped develop a regional drywall gypsum wallboard recycling program for what was then Domtar Gypsum in Newington, New Hampshire. And that's another long story as to how that happened. But I was constantly calling the research center because they had done a lot of work in various areas. And finally, one of their officers said, who the hell are you? Why do you keep calling us? And I said, well, I'm a graduate student, former builder. And after the second time I talked to him, he said, would you be interested in interviewing with us? So literally before I defended my master's thesis, the research center had already hired me as a research analyst. So,
by then it was too late.
Yeah. Well, I had a health problem that got me off the job site, and it was, tough because my wife and I were just married. I couldn't go back to the job site. Like, what the hell am I going to do? And so it went from a little bit scary for the two of us to, stumbling into a really cool research project that was funded by Domtar Gypsum, and then stumbling into a job before I even had completed my master's. So I went from pretty lousy luck to really good luck. And I thought I knew building after I was done at the research center. And then when I worked for Building Science Corporation, I got my head handed to me all over again by Joe Stiebrick. And that's where I met Steve. That's a pretty good segue to, the relationship Steve and I have had over the years, given that he's an independent architect and I'm an independent consultant. Did I set you up good there, buddy?
Can you, Pete? Can you say that the fact that you and Steve have been friends for 20 years actually means that somebody can tolerate him?
Oh,
Yeah, well,
shots fired. Shots
Oh,
fired,
man.
gentlemen.
Yep.
Steve, do you remember
It
the
may as
first
well
time
start now.
first time we presented together at EBA, and I went first, and I took too much time, and you had like 300 slides to do in 10 minutes. And ever since then, you've been turning that around into making me shorten up my presentation so you can run over.
It's been a dream every day, buddy.
And so then after your time at BSC, Pete, what happened next for you?
Well, Building Green turns out was, I left Building Green Environmental Building News because they were really focused on commercial, and I was much more interested in focused on residential. And then privately, Building Green and Taunton were talking about developing a green building resource, sort of like, peanut butter on my chocolate, chocolate on my peanut butter, because Building Green had a strong reputation for writing. Fine Home Building has a really strong reputation for both writing and visuals. So I didn't know that Taunton Press and Building Green were trying to develop a residential resource until Alex Wilson approached me and said, "Hey, you want to come back to Building Green?" So that was really cool because that was 2 years of developing Green Building Advisor, working pretty much, I don't know, Steve, every other day with you, developing content for the website.
Yeah.
Working with Mike Girton. The Green Building Advisor team was just so cool because we had like a dozen building professionals from all across the United States who helped us develop the website. So that was really cool to go from Building Science Corporation, work with Steve and my brother a while in a consulting firm where we cut our teeth learning, doing stuff that we had done at Building Science Corporation, but on our own, to turning back to a publisher. And Steve joined the editorial advisory board of Building Green because of his skills, linking design with systems thinking. So Steve and I have been, for 20 years, sort of weaving our way through our work to then eventually end up where we are today, which is, I talk more to Steve than probably any of my brothers.
We are heavily entwined. I mean, one of the interesting things about the three of us that I find is, yes, we're doing the podcast. Yes, we know each other professionally, but I talk to both of you probably at least once a day almost on the phone casually to say, hey, what's up? How's life going? Hey, did you hear about this? Did you see that post or this email or whatever the case? But yeah.
Pete and I are both shaking our heads, and we have to remember that we're on a podcast and nobody can see us shaking our heads. I'm watching Pete shake his head, and I'm seeing myself do it, and I'm going, yeah, I have to remember. I agree. I agree. So what about you, Steve? Where does this journey start for you?
So the journey for me starts, and I'm just going to throw this out because I love talking about it, but before the construction industry, I did 4 years in the Marine Corps. I won't get into all the long stories I have there. That's more the thanks to all my brothers and sisters out there listening that joined me under the Corps. Hoorah. But after I got out of the Marine Corps, it was a pretty interesting life for me because I got out and I worked a handful of jobs, some of which was a framer. Believe it or not, I did frame a couple houses. At that time, being 21 years old and 250 pounds and 6'6", it was more like, hey, you grab that beam and hold it up here while we nail it off or bolt it off. There wasn't a whole lot of framing experience being given there. It was more like I was the
You
forklift.
were the forklift?
Yeah. But, so I did that for a little while. I did worked as an electrician for a while. And God bless them guys. I mean, I just did one job as an electrician, and that was enough to realize, okay, let's probably not do this. I mean, pulling wire in a crawl space for a 4,000 square foot house. I was literally in this little 2-foot cavern, 4,000 square feet for, I don't know, a little over a month, just going through there, drilling holes, pulling wire, hey, go back down there and pull this wire over here and pop it up this hole. But the beauty of it is it gave me a really great appreciation for what later would become my life.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
And that's why even today as an architect, your favorite sheet in the plan set is the electrical page?
Yeah. Well, you guys know, but everybody else, my daughter and son are both in architecture school. My daughter comes to me, and I can't even tell you, Peter. You can ask her. I sit back and say, hey, Lexi, guess what? I cannot wait for the day where I never have to do another electrical plan. And she just smiles. But anyways, so I worked those couple of jobs. I met this lovely woman who became my wife. Short story is she was moving back to Boston. I came back to Boston. She said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, you know what? I'll go to school. And she said, well, what's interesting you? And I had this love of architecture, took it in high school and drafting and all that good garbage that, everybody talks about doing. But I actually pursued it, which leads me into the whole building science thing. So I graduated from Wentworth in Boston, worked for a large commercial firm for about a year. But then my life turned 90 degrees. And Joe came to Wentworth and was giving a lecture. Well, Betsy joined him, and Betsy was standing in the back of the room with the department head.
Hold on a second, Steve. That's Joe Stebrick and Betsy Pettit of Building Science Corporation, right?
That's correct, yeah. Sometimes I forget that not everybody knows what we know. But yeah, so Joe and Betsy came. Joe was lecturing. Betsy's in the back of the room talking with the department head. And Betsy goes to the department head, oh, yeah, we just got this recent contract, which was Building America at the time. It was just coming out. And she said, oh, we're looking for employees. We need, somebody to help us with drawing and architecture and all this stuff. And he looked at her, and I was good friends and had a great relationship with the department head there. Because when I was in college, keep in mind, because I went in the Marine Corps, I was 4 years older than most of the people there. So I became a little friendlier with the teachers and professors, etc.
Probably a little more focused and
professional. More focused, yeah. I didn't go out drinking on Friday night. I went home and built a model and hung out and watched a movie with my wife because.
And you were married, yeah.
And I was married, and and I did enough drinking in the 4 years. But
you got that out of your system.
Got that out of my system. So. So the department head says, believe it or not, I got the perfect guy for you. So he calls me up the next day and says, hey, I want you to meet this woman, Betsy Pettit. She's going to be calling you, and they're looking to hire somebody. So Betsy did call me the next day. That weekend, I went out. I met them at their house in Brookline, and they hired me on the spot. And, 10 years later, after working with Building Science Corporation, like Peter said, we broke out, me, Peter, and his brother. We did this little joint venture thing where we worked on a number of projects for a number of years, and then we all decided, hey, we're kind of doing separate things, but we're still friends, but let's go do our separate things, keep our friendship, and we'll overlap and help each other as need be. And so I started Stephen Baczek Architect and never looked back. And the beauty, I think, is, and the privilege of working at Building Science Corporation is such that I forget a lot of times that when I look at things, I don't look at them like a traditional architect. Like an architect sits there and, I get emails and instant messages on Instagram all the time from architects and builders, and they say, well, what about this? What about that? And it's like, I don't even look at that because that's really not that important to me because this is more important. And that's why we're doing this podcast. But the whole set of filters that I have and the way that I perceive buildings is a lot different. And, one of the things I think is extremely ironic is, having known Joe and Joe coming down from Canada, we sit there today and we can go on Instagram and we can talk about an air sealing detail or something that somebody's posting. And then I can sit there and, Peter and I will be driving to a seminar or something and joking about, that's a cool detail. These people think they invented it, but believe it or not, I drew that detail back in, 95. And for the builder's guide or whatever the case is. So it's a lot of this stuff isn't new. It's just finally getting its due time, which I credit a lot to Joe. I mean, Joe has spent a lifetime and career, and Betsy, a lifetime and a career trying to get information out and getting us to understand buildings a little deeper. And, I think
and
part
he's
of what...
a really good explainer. And that goes a long way because I'm working my way through that Gus Handegord book that you recommended, Steve. And that is way less, I'm way less able to understand that than I am, the same sentence in different words from Joe or one of you guys too.
Well, one of the interesting things, Jake, is, a lot of people always say, Steve, man, I love the way you're just able to break this down and keep it simple. Well, as much as I would love to take credit for all of that, a lot of that is Joe. I mean, think about a young architect in his, late 20s that gets to ride on an airplane or sit in a car for 2 hours with Joe coming home from a building investigation and talking about why the building failed. Joe has things like that he calls Joe math, right? That he rounds up to the nearest 1, 10.1. Joe doesn't like, decimal places, doesn't like calculations, all of that stuff. But his ability to take an extremely complex concept and boil it down really, really taught me a lot. And I'm very thankful to have known him for that. So, 10 years at Building Science Corporation, go out on my own, still hanging with great guys like Peter. A couple years, go by. I meet a fine builder like yourself, Jake, and next thing you know, we're doing some pretty cool projects. We're applying all this building science, and here we are today, episode 1 of the podcast, where I think we can all agree that this is about giving back a little, right? We all have some great information. And this is about giving it back.
So that means last but not least, Jake, you need to jump in.
And so it is funny how we were able to weave our 3 stories together there without even talking about that beforehand, because my journey to get here is credited to you guys. I had I'll back up actually. When I was 13, I got kicked out of Boy Scout summer camp for smoking cigarettes. And my dad said, guess who doesn't get the rest of their summers to themselves from now on?
Good for you, Jake.
And so I got into this early on, and I have been interested in it in different ways since then. I worked for my dad in high school. When I was in college, going to get a degree in art, I actually had a little bit of a hard time getting along with my dad, and the only time I really haven't been in the actual carpentry construction side is that time in college when I worked for a lumberyard and ran a second shift for a lumberyard, which actually taught me a lot, because being at the lumberyard that many hours a week, I was like, oh, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that we don't use. Why is this stuff here, and why are other builders using it, and why aren't we, when I worked for my dad? And then after college, I made a living as an artist for a little while, and then I got suckered into coming back to work for the family business. And after the first or second project back, my dad said, hey, I'm going to sell the business. And dumb me said, oh, who are you going to sell the business to? He's like, well, somebody that works for me, and I was the only employee. And so I thought, well, I liked being my own boss in the art world. Maybe I'll try being my own boss in the carpentry world. And I hadn't realized it at that time, that the reason that I didn't really love construction yet was because I wasn't happy with the way that we did things. And I didn't realize that it wasn't, I just felt, how do I say this? I felt like things could be done better, but I didn't have the ability to do that when I worked for my dad. We were a renovation and repair company. Everything we did was budget-minded. In the 80s, 90s, when that company was in his hands, if you remember, nobody had a cell phone. So if you left for work, the contractor made decisions without asking you, and then that was what you got. I remember a couple years ago I had a client ask me about redoing the casing molding around this big 15-foot wide doorway from their house to a living room. And I said, this is kind of weird. And she said, well, that used to be the garage. And I said, okay, and so you want to redo the casing because it doesn't match anything else in the house? She was like, exactly. We left the contractor here, went to work, came home, and he was like, ta-da! And we were like, well, we love that oak casing. I wish it matched anything else in the rest of the house. And I realized that was kind of an epiphany moment for me, where I was like, oh my goodness, that's exactly how the business operated when I worked for it when my dad was in charge. You couldn't get a hold of people during the day. We didn't have the ability to email. We didn't have 15 sets of prints or the ability to print off a new set of prints right away and make all these marks on them and all that kind of stuff. So I started focusing on the things that I thought were important, and that was how to be better at installing crown molding, how to be better at making sure my walls were straight, things like that. And it took a couple years for me to get through that and then get through being able to run a business, because I have no formal business training, and that's a thing that I'm still working on, obviously. But then I had a client ask about Passive House, and I had no idea what Passive House was. And so I said, yeah, let me get back to you tomorrow. And what happened was I got online and found a Fine Home Building video series that Steve was doing with Justin, the guys at Fine Home Building, and literally called and said, hey, I have some questions about Passive House. I have a client that's interested. And Steve was like, yeah, come on out. We'll go out to Martha's Vineyard and look at a couple houses. And I somehow convinced that client from Columbia, Missouri, in a market that is not at all concerned with energy efficiency or durability. They're concerned with making things look like the neighbor's house in that subdivision that they're building in, to go to Martha's Vineyard for, I don't know, 2 or 3 days and see 4 houses. And the clients ended up paying for a set of plans from Steve, but they didn't end up building the house. They ended up purchasing a 5,000 square foot energy hog on a lake that they were happy with. But on that ferry ride from, what is it, Falmouth out to the vineyard?
Falmouth out to the vineyard.
The client took a phone call, and Steve pulled out a set of plans, and we started looking through them. And I was like, oh, this is more detailed than I've ever seen on any set of plans that I've ever looked at. Right. This is the architect that I want to be working for. And then it just, as you said the other day when we were talking, Pete, then it just became drinking from a fire hose in every opportunity that I had. And meeting you at IBS a couple years ago, or 5 years ago maybe, it really changed the way I thought about my business and about what we were doing. And I really started to get worried that I had been screwing things up for 25 years or 20 years. So so now I want everybody else to know that, because I so recently was doing things in what I feel are probably not the best manner. Now, we were always diligent. I was the best at installing Tyvek out of anybody out there. Our Tyvek rep knew me by name, had been by our sites because I'd had questions. We'd challenged him on things. Like, that was the end of me being that builder before I discovered all these other things in building science. So I'm really happy that you guys have decided to join me on this.
Hey, so I just want to real quickly talk a little bit about why we chose UnBuild It, because I was not a big fan of this name. But it's really cool that, and I'm going to say this is what I think it's about, maybe it's not, but that we spend our time building things, and this podcast is about breaking things down. So we can't understand how we put things together until we understand how to break them down. Did I get that right?
Yeah. I think the idea of us trying to unpackage ideas so that they're broken down into smaller very understandable packages. Yeah. And I think the other side to that UnBuild It idea is the ongoing argument that we have amongst ourselves when we challenge each other's ideas.
Yeah, and I would agree, Peter. My architect training would suggest that, 5 years in architecture school, all we did was break things down to have the ability to analyze them independently. And then once we have a very good understanding, we then synthesize those pieces, put them back together as a building to understand it as a whole. But when you put it back together as a whole, you have to understand the contributions of each of the parts to the whole, as well as the effects of all the components to the whole. Because just because you can build a building doesn't mean that you're necessarily making the right choices in materials, putting those assemblies together. So yes, I think you hit it. I mean, I think the UnBuild It is a great name from that perspective, that the three of us, given our backgrounds, and I'll list that, Peter being the building scientist, building investigation part, myself being the architect, and Jake being the builder. I talked earlier about having a set of filters. Well, one of the beauties of this podcast is that it's not three architects and it's not three building scientists. It's three totally different people that are friends, but our experiences are different, our backgrounds are different. Our set of filters that we use to understand and unbuild things complements each other enough that the listeners are going to get this extremely wide spectrum of information based on each of us coming together. So in a lot of ways, the three of us are the breakdown and putting it back together.
So, Steve, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but that was really well said. But I just want the record to show.
I can't believe you said that either, Peter.
Yeah, me neither. But okay.
I just want the record to show that I would choose three building stooges instead of UnBuild It. I just want the record to show. Oh, nice laugh, Jake. That was good.
Hey, my number one vote was for three cool tools, but you guys shot that down in a heartbeat.
And we won't be taking a vote on that. It is UnBuild It Podcast, and it'll stay that way. I don't think that we need to be tools or stooges in either way. I think that the conversation continues from here with the idea that that idea of decision making is influenced by the internet very heavily today, and we're obviously this is a podcast. It's published online, so we're very cognizant of the fact that we're online and we're part of a community. We're all active on Instagram. Steve and I more than Lazy Bones Yost here when it comes to Instagram, but we want this to be an interactive experience for you guys as well. So if you find something that you'd like to challenge us on, or that you'd like to hear us talk about as well, before we forget to mention it, it's questions at unbuilditpodcast.com or theunbuilditpodcast.com. Questions at theunbuilditpodcast.com. Sorry about that. If there's something, questions, comments, concerns, if you can't handle the fact that Peter breathes heavy into his microphone, let him know. Things like that. I'm kidding, Pete. I saw you snap your head around. So I think that, gentlemen, are we to a point where we want to say thank you for listening and tune into the next episode?
Yeah, great talking with you guys.
Always a pleasure, gentlemen.
Okay.
And thank you to our listeners.
You guys. Thank you guys for
Take
tuning
care, buddies.
in. Thank you for subscribing. Don't forget to subscribe. Check us out on Instagram. It's UnBuild It Podcast on Instagram. Steve's going to lean in and say Steve Baczek Architect on Instagram.
You got that right. Got to get those numbers up. Steve Baczek Architect.
I'm not really sure what my name is on Instagram.
How like
it's Building
Peter.
Right Peter.
Right. WRI.
With a dash
as well.
Probably.
And mine is Jake.Bruton, Bruton. Until next time, thank you for subscribing. Thank you for tuning in for episode number 1. Stay tuned for number 2, where there's a little bit more information.
See you guys.